Hey, welcome back here, Coastal Daybreak here on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Thanks for joining us. And joining us from the UNC Institute of Marine Science, talk a little bit about oyster reefs. Dr. Joel Fodrie is with us. Good morning, Joel. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you on here. Tell us a little bit about your work. What do you do?
Our lab does fisheries ecology within estuaries, broadly speaking. We work with finfish. We work with the habitats that the fish use. That includes the marshes and the seagrasses and, of course, the oyster reefs.
Well, tell us about this part. And the subject here, the headline in the Coastal Review was a reef says carbon sinks. What does that mean?
Right. So broadly speaking, people are interested in things called ecosystem services that habitats provide. Oysters provide houses for fishes and shrimps and crabs. It filters the water.
And make new oysters.
That's right. And one of those services that people are interested in more and more is the ability of coastal habitats like marshes and oyster reefs, perhaps, is to capture carbon and bury carbon.
Oh, really? So that's what it means by sink.
Right. So it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and then putting the carbon into the sediments in a place that is sequestered from all the little bugs that would like to metabolize that carbon and respire it as CO2.
Oh, so I think we think of carbon dioxide as something that plants take in, but you're saying that reefs.
Yeah, so it's there's some complexity there, but it's neat. So what is fixing the CO2 is the phytoplankton, the little itty bitty plants that are in the water.
Oh, okay.
And then the oysters are filtering that out, and then rapidly depositing it as essentially poop in the reef, and then it buries it quickly because the reef is accreting vertically upwards. And that gets that carbon, the organic carbon that used to be phytoplankton, sort of out of the system, so it can't be respired.
Right. Okay. And so now you have, again, all the creatures that live off of it, too.
Right. So. The reefs are again, really interesting because there's actually two types of carbon. There's that organic carbon we were talking about. There's also the carbon that's in the shell. Shell is calcium carbonate. And we need to be honest.
The longer it stays in the shell, the less it's released ultimately.
Well, that's what you would think. That's what I thought when I started out, but the story gets more complex in a fun way. When you make calcium carbonate in the ocean, a byproduct of that is actually venting CO2. So creating shell for an oyster in the water actually puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And so we want to be honest about the types of things you get from habitats because it can't all be roses. Sometimes they're not providing the services we want. And some oyster reefs, because they have so much shell, are actually a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere. Other reefs have less shell, have more of that gooey organic material because they're filtering it out, and they're more sinks. And so you can go to reefs within our estuaries that are functioning as net sinks of CO2, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then you've got some that are actually net sources that are venting CO2.
Do they balance?
Some reefs balance. Some reefs on balance are net CO2 sinks, and some are net CO2 sources. Essentially, if you go to a reef that's near a marshy area, it's more likely to be a CO2 sink. There's more of that organic material, less shell. If you go to these really good-looking reefs, the Taj Mahal of reefs that are out on these sand flats that you can see sometimes that are just rocks, those have so much shell that those are probably on net venting CO2 to the atmosphere.
Make a difference if it's exposed or if it's covered?
It does. So we're at a neat place along the coast. We should all be thankful is that we've got sort of a diversity of habitat types and reef types. So north of us, we tend to have more subtidal reefs. South of us, to Wilmington, South Carolina, Georgia, we have more intertidal reefs. And that has to do with the neat ecology of reefs and what determines if an oyster reef can live or not in different environments. And salinity is a big part of that. And then inundation, or how much time they're exposed as the tide goes up and down, is another big part of that. And so the data that we have, which needs to be tested more and verified, would say that the subtidal reefs are probably more sinks. They're grabbing more CO2. Those intertidal reefs like we have here in Back Sound and Bogue Sound to some degree, those are probably sources. And so people can use that information, right? So if you want to design a restoration project, you want to be honest with people about the benefits they're going to get.
And there are benefits both ways.
There's many benefits. So your benefit may be to have harvestable oysters, and that may guide where you'd want to put an enhancement project. Your benefit that you care about may be protecting a shoreline. But we can list these different suite of services, and we can sort of quantify them so that we can let people decide for themselves what suits their needs.
Okay, so when the kids go out with the Coastal Federation and they're planting bags of oysters and they're going out and that, is there some decision process about where they're going to go to serve the best interests?
Right. So in my experience, the Coastal Fed's been really focused on sort of shoreline protection. That usually puts them sort of in that intertile environment where you can get lots of oysters to grow if the environmental conditions are right. I would say the opportunity there is that they're often pairing that reef restoration with marsh restoration. So they're going in and they're trying to build both a reef seaward of a marsh, and they're trying to augment or create a marsh. And in those environments, you can get a lot of that burial, both from the oyster reef, but also the reef is protecting the marsh, and the marsh is bearing a lot of carbon. Those are marsh plants. They're grabbing that CO2, and then they're getting buried in an accreting marsh.
Yeah, as the sand comes up on them,
right,
et cetera.
And some of our data, some of our restoration has shown. And when I say we, I mean very broadly. This stuff started in the 1990s with graduate students that were IMS. They built reefs next to marsh, and in many cases, the marsh around those reefs has expanded greatly. And at control sites, the marsh has kind of eroded away or just kind of maintained a balance. And so, designing oyster restoration in a way that you're pairing it with marsh, you can get lots of services related to direct carbon burial, or you can help those other habitats that are doing other services like habitat and carbon burial and water filtration.
How important is it that we recycle our oyster shells?
Yeah, so North Carolina has lost probably 90% of our oyster reefs over historical time. And probably the leading driver of that is just the loss of the substrate. So oysters have a life history in which they spend part of their time floating around as larvae, and those larvae need a place to settle.
Right.
And the landing pad they're looking for, spat, exactly. The landing pad they're looking for is shell. And so over time, the way people have fished is often remove that shell, not only the live oysters, but the underlying old dead grandparents and great-grandparents of the oysters.
Right.
And so we've removed that landing strip for the larvae. If the larvae lands kind of in a mud or sandy area, most time it doesn't make it. So anytime that you can get substrate out in the right environment, along our coast right here in Carteret County, you're often going to get a heavy fall of spat.
So those folks who have a mountain of oyster shells behind their shed, they can still be useful?
They can be. You can always donate that shell to places like the Coastal Fed or in sometimes marine fisheries. And those people are learning more and more. We're all learning more and more about where you can put that shell to maximize recruitment of those spat and then the services that we care about. It might be harvesting oysters, or it might be the other services.
I know the convenience stations, landfills around here have those recycling boxes to use, and so we should use them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean the single largest limiting factor in how many oysters we have in North Carolina is substrate. And so the more substrate we can get back in the estuaries in the right spots, the better off we'll be.
Do you know if restaurants are on board with that?
I don't know. I know that some restaurants have programs, but I don't know how well coordinated it is.
Yeah.
I do know that we sort of live in very polarizing times, but it seems like everybody's pro oyster. Everybody gets it.
I mean, because it also cleans water. I mean,
people like to eat them. People like the cleaner water. People like the habitat for fishes. People like their shorelines protected. It seems like
the only thing they don't like is
win-win.
stepping on them. That's all.
Yeah. So when I came back to North Carolina 7 or 8 years ago, the last thing I wanted to do was work with oysters because they're sharp and they don't smell great all the time. But I got involved in research and over time have become a convert because they are a wonderful model for exploring estuaries. And also, they're clearly important for our culture and for our economy and for people's quality of life.
Yeah, when you look at the whole food chain, and when we talked about menhaden being the kind of the food of the sea, the oysters are like the founding landscape of the
So we sort of have these junction box species that are crucially important. Menhaden's one, shrimp's one. We have these species that form habitats like oysters or seagrass or marshes. Blue crab's another one of those sort of key nodes in a food web. And
Scallops
so,
and
scallops used to be. We're living in a time where scallop numbers are pretty far down.
yeah. So will oyster spat only land on oyster shells? Is that the only place they can actually grow? Or
no, they'll land on lots of hard substrates, and people have tried to find those mimics. And we're still working on the best type of substrate given different locations. Those are areas of active research.
You want to go online, coastalreview.org. We'll post that up on our page as well too. But also to check out the UNC IMS website as always to find out more about what they're up to. And Dr. Joel Fodrie joins us from the UNC Institute of Marine Science. And Joel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
This is Coastal Daybreak here on the Talk Station.